Again, it's a treat to see a nice class today of 21 as we begin Psalm 68. I've already prepared most of 69 as well, which is to say that today and tomorrow are longer psalms. This morning's psalm, Psalm 68, is largely building on a phrase that we who go to synagogue know very well. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Wait 1 second.
Sorry.
V'yafutzu oivecha misanecha. We sing that both when we take the Torah out of the ark and when we put the Torah back in the ark. It's a quote from Numbers, Bamidbar, 10:35, and you're going to hear that same phrase resonated right at the beginning of this psalm. Now, that verse describes, God and the people getting ready to march forward through the desert. Again, it's in Bamidbar, the description of the march through the desert. And this psalm has this quality of marching, transitions, processionals, even celebration. But Numbers 10:35 is in the context of protection from war and how the ark would go before the people into battle. In fact, in 1 Samuel 4, there's a dramatic story of the Israelites fighting against the Philistines and getting wiped out. And they're desperate, so they go and they say, we got to get our ark. If we have our ark, we can go back and be victorious. And they get their ark in 1 Samuel 4, and it says that the Philistines can hear the armies, the Israelite armies, now with the ark in their midst, in celebration. And the next day they go into battle, and the Israelites get devastated, and the ark gets captured. And when the ark gets captured, and the priest Eli, the one famous for Hannah, with her prayer at Shiloh, when he hears that the ark, this is early Israelite history, has been captured, he dies. He's like crushed to think that the Holy Ark is gone. So in this psalm, there's the imagery of that Holy Ark. And this, scholars will say, is among the earliest of the psalms. Because in this psalm, and I'll point out later, there's the sense of all the 12 tribes still being part of Israel. Early, maybe also early because it's long, it's not as edited. It also reflects, according to Robert Alter, some of the poetry of Canaan. And what's clearly true is that this psalm resonates with images and even words from two important parts of the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 33, Moses' farewell address, and early on, Devorah, that's before King David. Devorah has battle also with the Philistines, with Sisera. Judges chapter 5 will have some of the same words as in Psalm 68. So that Psalm 68 has this military dimension. I mentioned in my little letter about Psalm 68 that the Huguenots called it the war march. It was used widely as a psalm in religious contexts in medieval Europe, including among the Crusaders. There's the sense of the army marching forward. And yet, I'll also point out that where God in this moment in Numbers is described as the God of war and the ark as a shield, here God will also be the God who takes care of the widow and the orphan. And with that, I will add, Benjamin Siegel, who I often quote for his book on Psalms, will say this is the most difficult of all the Psalms, both to translate. There's a lot of, here's a fancy word, hapax legomena, which is Greek for meaning only said once. In this psalm, there are many of these hapax words and phrases, allowing for lots of divergent interpretations, because you don't have to look in the concordance and compare how else it was used. There are also those rarely used words. Here's one other thing linguistically that's very interesting. There are 20 cases of a root word repeated within 5 words of each other in this psalm. So a root, almost like a rhythm, being repeated, and that's where they're only 5 words apart for proximity, emphasizing proximity. This is also a psalm with 6 different names of God, including some of the names of God like Shaddai, which is identified with Genesis, not used much in Psalms. All right, there's a lot more to be said, but it's a long psalm. So let's look at this psalm. 1 second. Here we go. It was hiding, but I got it. All right. 1 second. It's still being shy. All right. Psalm 68. And again, I've chosen to name the Psalms as a pattern from a phrase in the Psalm. And in this case, it's called, Arise, God, let God's enemies scatter. Benjamin Siegel entitles it, Marching with God to a Greater History. For the conductor, for David, a hymn song. Yakum Elohim Yafutsu Oivav, arise God, let God's enemies scatter, V'yanusu misanav mipanav, and let those that hate God flee before God, as dispersing smoke. Disperse them, as wax melts before fire, perish the wicked before God. But let the righteous be happy. Let them exult before God. Let them rejoice with happiness. Sing to God, hymn to God's name. Raise up God who rides upon the clouds with Yah as God's name, and exult before God. Parent of the orphan and a judge for widows is God in God's dwelling of holiness. God settles the solitary into a household. God brings out the imprisoned in celebration, but the rebellious abide in a parched land. God, when you went forth before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah. The earth rumbled, also the heavens drizzled down because of God. That's Sinai, because of God, the God of Israel. Drizzle of abundance, you poured down, God. When your inheritance was weary, you firmed her up. Your flock settled in it. You make firm in your goodness for the poor, God. My Supreme gave the word. The women who bear tidings are a great host. Kings of hosts flee, they flee, and mistress of the house divides out the spoils. If you lie down among the sheepfolds, the wings of the dove are inlaid with silver and her pinions with precious gold. When Shaddai scattered the kings there, it snowed on Zalmon. Mountain of God, Mount Bashan, mountain of peaks, Mount Bashan? Why do you leap, mountains of peaks? The mountain desired by God for God's dwelling. Yes, Adonai will abide there forever. The chariots of God are myriads, thousands of companies, my supreme among them, Sinai in holiness. You ascended to the heights. You captured captives. You have taken tributes among humanity. Yes, among the rebellious, Yah, God, may abide. Blessed be my supreme, day by day. God loads us the ale of our deliverance. Selah. The ale is for us an ale of deliverances, and to Adonai, my supreme, over death holds the outcome. Surely God will smash the head of God's enemies, hairy skulls of those parading about in their guilt. Said my supreme, from Bashan I will bring back from the depths of the sea, so that your foot may wade in blood, the tongue of your dogs from enemies may have its portion. They saw your processions, God, the processions of my ale, my king in holiness, first singers, after musicians, amid the young women playing timbrels. In choruses they bless God, my supreme, from the fountain of Israel. There is Benjamin, the youngest, leading them, chieftains of Judah stitched together, chieftains of Zebulun, chieftains of Naphtali, ordained by your God is your strength, strength of God, this that you have employed for us. From your temple over Jerusalem, kings bring to you tribute. Rebuke the beast of the reeds, the herd of bulls among calves of the peoples, who grovel with pieces of silver. God scatters the people who craved battles. Let notables come from Egypt. Let Cush stretch out her hands to God. Kingdoms of the earth, sing to God, hymn to my supreme. Selah, to the rider upon the heavens of heaven's yore. Behold, God blasts by sounding a sound of strength. Ascribe strength to God. Over Israel is God's pride, whose strength is in the skies. Awesome is God from your holy places, Ale of Israel, who gives strength and power to the people. Blessed be God. Now, the references here are often obscure. Take the word Bashan, Mount Bashan. It's not clear what Mount Bashan is. Some say it's in reference to Mount Hermon because it has snow on it. There is one mention of Bashan in what is near present-day Nablus, Shechem, but it doesn't have snow. A lot of the imagery throughout the psalm is identified with Mount Sinai. In the classic commentary is that this is an ode to the revelation of Mount Sinai. And it's about the redemption from Egypt leading to the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. And the nations are the nations that God offered the Torah to, but rejected it. The other way that classic commentators read it is that this is a march through history toward a messianic future in which all nations will pay tribute to God. And in that sense, it's a description of the history of Israel from Egypt to Sinai, but moving toward a trajectory into the future. Now, this psalm, you often look for the word Selah to know where the psalm would be divided. What's distinctive in the use of Selah in this psalm, usually Selah comes at the end of a section. And I shared with you the Nachum Sarna comment that Selah may be from Sal, which in Hebrew means a basket or a drum, as if it's like a boom, on a drum to mark the end of a section. But in this case, there will be Selahs like in verse 8. But the Selahs come to mark the beginning of a new phase of the psalm. So verse 8, 7-8, is the beginning of a new phase. In that regard, 1 to 7 is an introduction. It's a description of God, God's might. Then, beginning verses 8 to 19 is a description of the past. This is Benjamin Siegel's division. The long march to freedom is verses 8 to 19. And then verse 20 will have that word Selah, but in this case, the beginning of a new phase, which is the current dash future, in which there is conflict that will lead to celebration, and then the coming of the nations with tribute. In the section on the past, a word appears 6 times. That's the word har, or mountain. And in the final section, there's a word that appears 6 times, and that's the word az, which means then, as if it's moving toward the next phase from the past, toward the current and potentially the future. I'll start at the beginning, and what I'm looking to do, and I have to pace myself because, again, we only have about 12 minutes at this point, and that is, I mentioned 10:35 of Numbers with verse 2. In some ways, this is a midrash, an expansion of this image of the ark, which moves before the people. Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha, that's what we sing, Numbers 34, right, 10:35. But here it's a little bit different. It's Yakum Elohim, and it's not the Yud He Vav He, it's a different name for God, Elohim. And Elohim is known as the God of judgment. Yud He Vav He is the intimate God of Israel. Also the God of war is often identified with Elohim because it's judgment. And at least for some of the classic commentators, that already sets up a difference. This is about God's judgment from Egypt to Sinai and beyond. But again, verse 2 is a paraphrase that we all know from the Torah, Numbers 10:35. The word that will be reoccurring, particularly in the first 8 verses, if you don't count verse 1, so verses 2 to 9, 8 times you get the word mipanav or mipnei, which means before, but it also means God's face. This is a psalm in which God's name is mentioned. I meant to add this up. 43 times. So God, one of the 6 names of God is 43 times. Here it's 8 times, before God. And yet there's a very important shift about this God. We're told about this God, who has such power. Verse 3, disperse as dispersing smoke, disperses them, they being the enemies. As wax melts before fire, perishes the wicked before God. This sense of God's power. And yet, if you look at verse 5, sing to God, hymn to God's name, raise up God who rides upon clouds with Yah as God's name, and exult before God. I will first note that in the ancient Near East, the god of the early Bible was Baal. And in Ugaritic texts, from the area of Syria today, Baal is called the rider of clouds. That's a nickname for Baal. And so the same imagery, again, pointing out to how early this psalm is. God, and we'll have this repeated later in the same psalm toward the end. 34, To the rider upon the heavens of yore, behold, God blasts by sounding a sound of strength. So God is the rider of the clouds in verse 5. And then look at the shift in verse 6 and 7. Parent of the orphan and a judge for widows is God in God's dwelling of holiness. God settles the solitary into a household and brings out the imprisoned in celebration, but the rebellious abide in a parched land. Now, verse 7 is often understood as Egypt. It doesn't rain much in Egypt. They rely on the Nile, hence the image that without the Nile, it's a parched land, or after the plagues, it's devastated. This is God in verse 7 delivering the Israelites from being in their respective homes or isolated from each other by virtue of slavery into households, brings out the imprisoned in celebration. But there's another dimension, which is again verse 6, and that is that the God Almighty, the God of the heavens, takes care of the orphan and the widow from God's dwelling of holiness. That could be from the heavens. God exists there and in the temple, which will also appear in this psalm. And this is something important to share, as these two verses, 5 and 6, are quoted in the Talmud in Megillah 31b. Kol makom she'ata motzeh gevurota shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In each place where you find a description of the might of the Holy Blessed, be Holy One, verse 5, Sham motzeh avutanuto. There too you find his lowliness, his humility. And so the image of this psalm, and we've seen this in the Bible, but it is what is distinctive to the Canaanite religion, is this is the God who cares about the orphan and the widow. And again, I just emphasize this statement of the Talmud because God is presented throughout rabbinic writings as our exemplar, and that is with great might you find great humility. With the great power to ride the heavens is the focus of God on those who are orphaned and widowed, who need a protector. And that, of course, can also refer to Israel, but we see this, of course, repeated throughout the Bible. And I mention that because one of the commentators marks this 5 and 6 as a shift in the psalm, and I don't see it as a shift in terms of viewing God, and I don't think so. I think that God is just presented in complex ways throughout the text. So now listen to Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy, Moses' farewell speech, 34:7. And you'll see it how it's echoed. O Jeshurun, there is none like God, riding through the heavens to help you, through the skies in his majesty. The ancient God is a refuge, a support, are the arms everlasting. He drove out the enemy before you by his command, destroy. Thus Israel dwells in safety, untroubled as Jacob's abode, in a land of grain and wine, under heaven's dripping dew. O happy Israel, who is like you, a people delivered by the Lord, your protecting shield, your sword triumphant. Your enemies shall come cringing before you, and you shall tread on their backs. And now let me read one other. I mentioned that the other major source for resonance is the book of Judges. And there you have the song of triumph sung by Devorah and her general Barak as they had subdued Sisera. Look at 8 and 9. God, when you went forth before your people and you marched through the wilderness, the earth rumbled, also the heavens drizzled down because of God. That's Sinai, because of God, the God of Israel. O Lord, when you came forth from Seir, advanced from the country of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens dripped. Yea, the clouds dripped water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, him of Sinai, before the Lord, God of Israel. I'm going to share just one more from Judges, and that's if you look at verses 13 and 14. Kings of hosts flee, they flee, and mistresses of the house divides out the spoils. If you lie down among the sheepfolds, the wings of the dove are inlaid with silver, and her pinions with precious gold. Now, here, Judges, two different verses as an example. Verse 30, verse 16 and then verse 30 of chapter 5. Why did you stay among the sheepfolds and listen as they pipe for the flocks among the clans of Reuben with great searchings of heart? Now verse 30. They must be dividing the spoil they have found, a damsel or two for each man, spoil of dyed clothes for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloths, a couple of embroidered cloths round every neck as spoil. But the image of the spoil here is the image of a woman's voice, and you hear women's voices in this psalm. But here it's Sisera's mother awaiting her son, the general, to return with spoils. Here, in contrast, so here you get the women in verse 12. The women who bear tidings are a great host. But here it's not the enemy's women, it's the Israelite women celebrating victory. And the image of lying down among the sheepfolds in the Song of Deborah is in regard to those who did not go into battle, and it has a negative connotation. Here it's saying, even if you didn't go into battle, if you lie down among the sheepfolds, nonetheless, the wings of the dove are inlaid with silver and her pinions with precious gold, which is obscure. Here's an example of possibilities. Verse 14. That wings of the dove are inlaid with silver and her pinions with precious gold can refer to the booty that's being taken by the soldiers. It can be a put down of those who were like doves and, spoiled by silver and gold and therefore didn't go into battle. Or it can be a metaphor for peace in the classic commentators, which is just to say this, even more than most Psalms, is subject to multiple divergent ways of understanding. Two more verses just to focus in on. A phrase that's, again, interesting, verse 21. The ale is for us an ale, and again, that word ale is the same name of God in Canaan, like the Baal, right? Baal has the ale in his name. The ale is for us an ale of deliverances, and to Adonai my supreme, over death holds the outcome. And here's one of those obscure words, totsaot. It's not clear what totsaot means. In the Talmud, they'll comment that it's gematria, that its numerological equivalent is 903. And they'll say that demonstrates there's 903 ways of dying that God controls. But that could be in verse 20, that last phrase, either redemption from death for the Israelites, God protects them from dying in battle. It can mean, on the other hand, God brings death to the enemies, or it can be messianic, as the psalm will move toward the end, looking to the future. And with that, verse 28. Here's another example of obscurity. There are 4 tribes mentioned in verse 28. Benjamin, Judah, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Why those 4 tribes? There's at least 3 different explanations. In Judges 5:18, that Song of Deborah, these are among the tribes mentioned. Second possibility, they represent 2 tribes from the south and 2 tribes from the north, that being Zebulun and Naphtali, saying this is all the tribes, a sense of how old the psalm is and suggesting unity. And last, these 4 represent 4 different mothers. Judah had, 2 wives and 2 handmaids. These are the 4 women of Judah in the Bible. Hence, another way of saying everybody is represented. So 3 different ways of parsing why those 4 tribes, and what each of those 3 explanations have in common is that what is being described is an ancient Israel, but not so ancient that there was not yet a temple, which you'll see in verse 30. From your temple over Jerusalem, kings bring you tribute. And here there's this great sense of celebration. They saw your procession, God, the procession of my El, my King in holiness, first singers, after musicians, and the young women playing timbrels. In choruses they bless God, my supreme, from the fountain of Israel. And now, as we move toward the end of the psalm, the sense of nations coming to bless God. One other, and the last of the phrases, and then I'm already now in overtime, I'll look to pull it together. But this phrase, I translated, who grovel, in verse 31, who grovel with pieces of silver. It's not clear in the context, though it continues, God scatters the peoples who craved battles. So that those people who craved battles seem to be the bad guys. But the words are obscure. So one commentator has it that they were corrupted. They were so corrupt that all they cared about was money, and they would grovel for money. That's an example of not only did they crave battle, but they were so lowly that they groveled for money. A wordplay, Midrash Shocher Tov, says matir pas. They means open palms. They had open palms to bribes. That's an example of how corrupt they were. So again, an interesting image of describing, or it can be, because it's what happens in verse 32. The notables are coming with stretched out hands to God. And that, in verse 32, can either be stretched out with bringing gifts. So rather than grovel, because it's one of those rare words in the Bible, it can be who come with open palms, with pieces of silver as a tribute. And the commentators are all over the possibilities in such a phrase. And so now everybody's coming. They're coming in procession to celebrate God. Others are coming with tributes. The kings are coming with tributes. And as verse 1, all the way back to the beginning, began with, I'd have to look around. I'm not going to, in terms of my notes. But we end with blessing God, Baruch Elohim, which goes back to, the image of the ark. So I'll pull this together, knowing that there's always more to share, but I want to hear some of your reactions. This Psalm, 36 verses, is a song that moves, keeps moving. There's a trajectory. But it's obscure what the references are. It seems to be the trajectory from Egypt to Mount Sinai, and then looking to the future, pointing to Deborah, the judge in Israel, that early judge, even before the kings, who was in battle, and where the ark came into play as a resource in those battles, promising that things would end triumphant. And yet, although early, it's also written at a time in which the temple already existed, in reference to the temple over Jerusalem in verse 30. A psalm that draws on the past of Deuteronomy and Moses' closing song, in Deborah and her song. Those are both songs, by the way, and this too is a song, which, to pull it together, means we relate as a spiritual people to God through song, through celebration of God's joining us on this journey across generations as a people with a hope in a future in which there will be a coming together of nations. So that too is the paradox. Psalms are written from the point of view often of a priest in the Temple of Jerusalem, and yet simultaneously reaching out to see the whole world united. All right, that's Psalm 68, 36 verses, a long one tomorrow too. Very different. Tomorrow's about somebody who seems crazy, saying that his enemies are trying to poison him because they're his enemies. It's an interesting psalm. Second most quoted psalm in the New Testament, Psalm 69. But now we're on 68 still. What are your reactions or thoughts, questions? Take 5 minutes, maybe a little 6, on Psalm 68.
If nobody else has anything, I have perhaps a comment, but I'll stand aside if anybody else has a comment.
I always like your comments, Richard. Go ahead.
Well, I'm looking at verse 8,
Okay.
and partially 9 and 10, because they sort of go together. When, oh God, when you went to the head of the army, when you marched through the desert, the earth trembled, the sky rained because of God. Because the God of Israel, you, Sinai, because the God of Israel, you released a bountiful rain, O God, when your own land languished, you sustained it. Now, I have a personal past history and also an imagination as well. And I see the earth as Israel is marching across the land and God with them, that the desert is literally trembling with at that point, that even if someone were observing this, surrounding nations and things like that, they would feel the trembling of the land as Israel marched through. And the rain coming before in the desert, that stands to me in stark contrast to the kind of desert or the kind of environment that the desert presents, which is dry and harsh. Yet, as there's some speculation here, but yet I see this as Israel is marching ahead of that march in spite of the dry, dusty land. There's rain that has come and settled the earth and makes it easy to walk on. And just as a little aside, and I'll try to do it very quickly. I used to race motorcycles in the desert, so I spent a lot of time out in the desert. And there were times when we would go out there and it would rain. Those were prime times to be in the desert because the land was, or the dusty ground was settled, and it was nice to be there. So anyway, I'll just pass that back to you.
So I'm just going to react and harvest, Richard, what you shared. And I always learn new things about you, racing motorcycles in the desert. I'm really, that's wonderful. But I'll focus on the image of the contrast between the parched desert and how wonderful it was to ride motorcycles on what is hard earth, but when it's been moistened and softened a bit by the rain. And that's a quality of care that God would have provided the Israelites, and more, that huge number of people marching through the desert could also be like a rumbling in terms of the sense of a marching as a metaphor. The other metaphor is, that At Mount Sinai, there was the shaking of the mountain. That's where you get Quakers from. It says the people charadu, that they trembled before God as if there was an earthquake at Mount Sinai, similar to Elijah later on, who's going to be recreating before he hears God's still small voice, some of that natural drama that was part of Mount Sinai. And the drizzle, the rain here, could also be manna in the desert, God enabling sustenance as they were moving toward and away from Mount Sinai. One other phrase just to pick up on, because I love to find when these verses get quoted elsewhere. Maimonides, in describing in his Mishnah Torah, his code of Jewish law, the responsibilities of a guardian for an orphan, will quote verses 5 and 6 in that legal passage to say, God is up above watching you, the guardian, and how you take care of the orphan that you are responsible for. And so I just love the fact that he quotes verses 5 and 6 in that legal context. And I'll also add that as we end Shabbat, really the prayer just before the Amidah, so we're finishing Shabbat on Saturday evening, we also chant as part of our prayers verses 5 and 6. Maybe also to say, as we get ready to leave Shabbat, we leave with the sense of God's protective cover, but also responsibilities up ahead in transition. So again, remarkable how these verses were used in other contexts to convey other messages. Any other reactions, Arnie?
Yeah, are there parallels to be drawn between, world events today and what's here in the Psalms?
Well, that's a good question, Arnie, because what I always have in the back of my mind is, how is this relevant to us today? And, this is such a large, sweeping psalm that has these resonances of Israel's former texts and times. And you can get so caught up in its historical sweep that it's important to ask the question you just asked, Arnie, how is it relevant for us today? For me, what I continue to marvel at is this last piece, which is that this warrior God, this is a warrior God, right? And this psalm most famously was used in religious wars, usually, like the Protestants against the Catholics. So the Protestants, like the Huguenots, they saw this as a marching song, meaning this is a war song. And yet, what's dramatic is what I was just focusing in on, and that's the description of God simultaneously as the God of the widow and the orphan. And so the trajectory of this psalm for our times, Arnie, is to say that one has to have a big frame to be hopeful. If you get caught up reading the newspaper any day, every day, you can see a broken world. But if you step back and you have this large canvas of time, which is what this psalm presents, you can then look forward, as this psalm does, to a time of celebration, of universal celebration. This ultimately is a psalm that I read as a psalm of hope, looking forward. That the arc of justice bends forward toward justice. And that's where I return. If you look at Rashi and Sforno, medieval commentators reading this psalm, they're reading it in a time in which Jews have very little power over their lives, and where they're reading this as a messianic psalm. They're reading this as a psalm looking forward to a future time where the victories, both of Deborah and the victories of God over the Egyptians, mean that one day in the future, the world will be a world of celebration in which all peoples will come to honor the oneness of the Creator. And so in that bigger swath, this is a reminder for me, Arnie, that we need to step back from the newspaper and read the newspaper. We need bifocals, but we need to step away in order to have hope that things are moving in a trajectory toward celebration rather than being caught in the quagmire of corruption.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Well, I'm glad you asked it, because that was something that I would, that I often need to bring to the foreground, which is the key question for us as we read Psalms together. And that is, why do we read the Psalms? And I'm going to pull it together because it's really now overtime. It's see 10:17. And that is, tomorrow we'll pick up. It's a longer Psalm. I think it's 30. It's over 30 verses also. And 31 verses. 37 verses. It's even a little longer. And that's to say, these are two longer Psalms. This Psalm, to sum up Psalm 68, seems for linguistic reasons and content to point to a very early composition, a difficult psalm in many ways to interpret, and yet at the same time, precisely because of those multivalent possibilities, there's a richness. Because of those poetic new words being introduced, there's the possibility of multiple understandings over what is clear. This is a psalm of triumph, a psalm that looks to the past and is linked to Moses, is linked to Devorah, brings women to the foreground in celebration, and points to the future of kings coming in tribute before God, and gives hope, and looks to the past with Mount Sinai as at the center, the giving of law as the hope of a harmony of the future. So I thank everybody. It's a delight to start the week with you. We're moving into Psalm 70 by the end of the week, which gives me a sense that we're making progress. I pull up Kaddish for anybody needing to honor a loved one. One second. I'm going to put up this time the transliteration part as we chant Kaddish. Yitkedal v'yitkedash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
Alma divra kirute v'yalik malchute v'chayechon uv'mechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'yizman kari v'imru amen. Yehi Rabba mevarach le'olamo me'ol mayan yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kudsha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechata damiran b'yalma v'imru amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Osei Shalom B'rumav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'el Kol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen. I thank each of you for getting my day going in learning together.